July 15th, 2026. Nearly a dozen people are dead, wounded, or missing in the Strait of Hormuz this morning. Not soldiers, not combatants, mariners. Commercial seafarers doing the oldest civilian job in human history, moving cargo across open water for wages, who went to work this week in a boat on an international waterway and were killed or maimed by cruise missiles fired by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. 7 commercial ships, hit by the IRGC in the current operational period. 7. The ships they hit were cargo vessels, tankers, vessels carrying goods through a waterway that every international legal framework in existence categorizes as a passage open to all commercial traffic without interference. The mariners on those ships were not military personnel, they were not intelligence operatives, they were not combatants of any kind. They were people earning a living on the water, transiting a strait that their employers' insurance policies, or their shipping companies, route planners, and the entire diplomatic architecture of the last several months had told them was either safe or approaching safe, and the IRGC fired cruise missiles at their ships anyway. That human fact, nearly a dozen mariners eliminated, wounded, or missing on commercial vessels in international waters, is the moral center of everything that happened next. At 6:00 a.m. Eastern Time on July 15th, 2026, U.S. Central Command launched precision munitions into Iran's cruise missile storage and launch sites on Greater Tunb Island. 90 minutes later, every one of those sites was gone. And then President Donald Trump went on Fox News and told the world, out loud, by name, what comes next. Power plants, bridges, the entire compression campaign. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why Trump naming power plants and bridges on Fox News represents the most significant strategic communication of this entire conflict, and why the 90-minute elimination of Greater Tunb Island's cruise missile infrastructure represents a specific and deliberate message about operational tempo, you need to understand the sequence of IRGC decisions that made this morning's strikes not just justified, but strategically mandatory. And you need to understand what the compression campaign actually means as a military doctrine when its targets are no longer purely military. Greater Tunb Island sits at the western approach to the Strait of Hormuz. Not metaphorically near the strait, physically located at its western mouth, positioned to observe, track, and threaten every vessel, transiting the most economically significant body of water on the planet. Greater Tunb has been under Iranian occupation since 1971, when the Shah seized it, along with Lesser Tunb Island and Abu Musa, from what would become the United Arab Emirates in the final days before British military withdrawal from the Gulf. The UAE has never relinquished its legal claim to the island. Iran has never acknowledged that claim. For 55 years, the island's disputed sovereignty has been one of the region's most persistent unresolved territorial grievances. And for most of those 55 years, it has been secondary to the larger geopolitical questions of the Gulf. The IRGC converted Greater Tunb into something more than a sovereignty dispute decades ago. It built cruise missile storage facilities on the island. It built launch infrastructure, the physical positions from which anti-ship cruise missiles can be fired at vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz's western approach. The island's geography is the source of its military value. Positioned as it is at the western mouth of the strait, cruise missiles launched from Greater Tunb have engagement windows against southbound and northbound tanker traffic that cannot be replicated from the mainland coast with the same geometry. The island sits inside the shipping lane's effective envelope. It is not firing from behind the coast at distant targets. It is firing from inside the transit corridor itself. At 6:00 a.m. Eastern Time, CENTCOM struck those sites with precision munitions. 90 minutes later, all of them were gone. The 90-minute figure is the operational detail that requires the most careful analysis, because it tells you something specific about what the cruise missile infrastructure at Greater Tunb Island looked like at 6:00 a.m. versus what it would have looked like at the beginning of this conflict. A 90-minute precision strike operation that eliminates every cruise missile storage and launch site on an island does not tell you that the operation was easy. It tells you that the number of sites remaining was consistent with a 90-minute completion timeline. The 6 consecutive nights of systematic strikes that preceded this morning, the nights that reduced air defense systems, cruise missile storage facilities, drone launch sites, naval infrastructure, and IRGC command nodes across the entire southern coast of Iran, had already consumed a significant fraction of whatever Greater Tunb Island had at the start of this operational period. What remained was enough for the IRGC to hit 7 commercial ships. It was not enough to survive a precision strike package long enough to pose a problem for a 90-minute completion timeline. The IRGC managed to strike 7 commercial ships and nearly kill a dozen mariners with what it had left on Greater Tunb Island. CENTCOM managed to eliminate everything it had left on Greater Tunb Island in 90 minutes. Those 2 facts together define the current military asymmetry in terms that require no additional analytical elaboration. Now focus on what Trump said on Fox News. Because the public naming of the compression campaign's next targets power plants, bridges, is not a spontaneous statement in a media appearance. It is a calibrated strategic communication delivered through a public broadcast medium to multiple simultaneous audiences, each of whom processes it differently, and each of whom the statement is designed to reach. Power plants, bridges. Let those two words sit for a moment before the analysis of what they mean as military targets and what they mean as a strategic communication. A power plant is not a military installation in the conventional sense. It does not store ballistic missiles. It does not house IRGC headquarters. It does not conduct maritime harassment operations or fire cruise missiles at tankers. What it does is provide the electrical infrastructure through which everything in a modern state functions. The factories that produce the goods, the hospitals that treat the sick, the water treatment facilities that process drinking water, the communications networks that allow command and control to function, the refineries that process petroleum products, and the homes and apartments of the civilian population that has nothing to do with the IRGC's targeting decisions and is currently dying in the streets, protesting a government it did not choose and cannot remove without external military help. Targeting power plants places the compression campaign in a different legal and moral category from the strikes that have characterized the previous weeks. International humanitarian law draws distinctions between military objectives, installations, weapon systems, combatants, and civilian infrastructure whose destruction predictably harms civilian populations, disproportionate to any military advantage gained. Electrical infrastructure that simultaneously powers weapons factories and civilian hospitals occupies a legally complex position in targeting doctrine that military lawyers carefully analyze before targeting decisions are made. The fact that Trump named power plants publicly, not as a classified targeting decision revealed by a leak, not as an inference drawn by analysts examining strike patterns, but as an explicit public statement of future targeting intent, means that the legal framework justifying such targeting has been assessed, reviewed, and approved at the highest levels of American national security decision-making. You do not announce a target publicly if the targeting authority to strike it has not been established. Bridges were already struck in the early phases of this conflict. Railway bridges in Golestan province of northeastern Iran, struck to sever the logistical arteries connecting Iran's military supply chain across the country's interior. Striking bridges is a category of infrastructure targeting that goes beyond the immediate military installation and into the physical connectivity of a nation's territory. The structural links through which military equipment, ammunition, fuel, and personnel move across geographic distance. The public naming of bridges alongside power plants confirms that the compression campaign is designed to operate on the full spectrum of Iranian infrastructure rather than remaining confined to explicitly IRGC military installations. Read that framework carefully. Power plants and bridges named alongside each other in a public presidential statement constitute the announcement of a campaign designed to compress the Iranian state's functional capacity, not just degrade the IRGC's military capability, but eliminate the physical infrastructure through which the Iranian state operates. When power plants go dark and bridges go down across a country the size of Iran, the consequences are not limited to the IRGC's ability to fire cruise missiles at tankers. They extend to the civilian population's access to electricity, to water, to medical care, to economic activity, to every dimension of daily life that modern infrastructure provides. This is the compression campaign named aloud, and its naming is the signal that the targeting calculus has shifted from surgical degradation of military capability to systematic reduction of state functional capacity. That shift does not happen by accident. It does not happen without deliberate high-level decision, and it does not happen publicly without the intent to communicate the shift to Tehran's decision-makers in terms they cannot misinterpret or explain away. The strategic communication embedded in Trump's Fox News statement is doing something specific that goes beyond the factual content of what he said. Public announcement of future targeting creates its own operational logic. Once the American president has publicly stated that power plants and bridges are next, the IRGC's shadow generals in the Strait of Hormuz cannot protect those targets through the dispersal and concealment strategies that have extended the operational life of their cruise missile and ballistic missile infrastructure. Power plants cannot be moved. Bridges cannot be hidden. The compression campaign's next target set is fixed, identified, and publicly committed to by the commander-in-chief. The only variable that remains is when. That is the function of making it public. It is not primarily a deterrence message, though it functions as one. It is a foreclosure of IRGC options. The IRGC's entire adaptive strategy in this conflict has been to disperse, move, conceal, and relocate its military assets faster than the American targeting chain can identify and strike them. Power plants cannot be dispersed. Bridges cannot be relocated. The compression campaign's publicly named infrastructure targets sit precisely where they have always sat, cannot be hidden from the surveillance architecture that has been watching every inch of Iranian territory for months and will be hit when the decision is made to hit them. The IRGC has not been making strategic decisions throughout this conflict. It has been making institutional survival decisions. That distinction is important, and it is the one that the beer muscles framing captures with surprising analytical precision. The tiny guy at the bar with beer muscles picking fights with the biggest guys in the room is not making a strategic calculation about likely outcomes. He is making an institutional identity decision about who he is, about what the IRGC means as an institution, what it stands for, what defines its relationship to the world, that supersedes the rational assessment of what the fight produces. The IRGC keeps striking commercial ships because stopping would mean admitting that the pressure campaign has won, that the deterrence posture that defined the institution's self-conception for 40 years has been defeated, and that the doctrine of depth and the doctrine of Hormuz coercion have been rendered operationally irrelevant by the combination of American precision air power, Arab coalition strikes, the naval blockade, and the autonomous sea drones now operating in the waterway the IRGC claimed as its territory. An institution does not make those admissions voluntarily, especially not an institution that has killed 50,000 of its own citizens, rather than allow domestic acknowledgement that its governing project has failed. The IRGC fires at commercial ships, not because the shadow generals have calculated that doing so improves Iran's strategic position. They have not. It demonstrably worsens it, as the 90-minute elimination of Greater Tunb Island's cruise missile infrastructure this morning confirms, but because firing is the only behavioral option consistent with what the IRGC is. Ceasing to fire is ceasing to be the IRGC, and the IRGC will accept the destruction of its military infrastructure before it will accept the dissolution of its institutional identity. This is the behavioral dynamic that makes the compression campaign not just militarily logical, but strategically necessary. If the IRGC will not stop regardless of the destruction of its conventional military capability, then the campaign must move to the next level of pressure, the level that targets not the IRGC's weapons, but the state infrastructure through which the IRGC maintains its existence as a governing institution. Power plants and bridges are not just electricity and connectivity, they are the physical substrate of state authority. A government that cannot provide electricity to its cities, that cannot maintain the bridge connections through which goods and people and emergency services move across the country, is a government whose functional authority over the territory it nominally controls is degrading toward zero. That degradation creates the conditions for the internal collapse that military operations alone cannot produce. The IRGC's leadership can survive in bunkers without power plants above them. They have their own generators, their own fuel supplies, their own hardened communications that do not depend on civilian electrical infrastructure. But the Iranian population that the IRGC claims to govern, and that is currently protesting in the streets despite being killed for it, cannot survive without electricity, without water treatment, without hospital power, without the functional infrastructure of a modern state. The compression campaign's targeting of civilian infrastructure is not designed to harm the IRGC's operational military capacity. It is designed to make the IRGC's continued governance of Iran untenable in the eyes of the Iranian population that must ultimately either sustain the regime or allow it to collapse. This is the strategic logic that connects the Fox News statement to the 50,000 dead protesters, to the shadow generals firing cruise missiles at ships they know they cannot protect from 90-minute elimination packages. The compression campaign is designed to accelerate the internal fracture that has been visible throughout this conflict. The cut broadcasts, the clerics calling the MOU treason, the command structure that cannot unify around a strategic direction. By removing the last remaining sources of material infrastructure that the IRGC uses to maintain its claim to governance. Now examine what the 7 ships and the nearly dozen mariners tell you about the specific tactical posture the IRGC is maintaining, even as its military infrastructure collapses around it. 7 commercial ships, struck in the current operational period. The number is the operational indicator. Not because hitting 7 ships represents a military achievement of any significance. The IRGC's cruise missiles reaching commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz produces military damage to exactly no military asset of the United States or the coalition. It produces human casualties among people who are not combatants, economic disruption to the shipping lanes that every nation's commerce depends on, and the continued confirmation of a behavioral pattern that has been the through line of every IRGC decision in this conflict. It will hit whatever is reachable, regardless of what the hitting produces in terms of military advantage. The mariners on those 7 ships are the irreducible human reality of this conflict. They are the people whose existence in the Strait of Hormuz constitutes the entire moral and legal justification for everything the United States has been doing since February 28th. Freedom of navigation is not an abstract principle. It is the right of those specific mariners to cross that specific body of water on their specific commercial voyages without having cruise missiles fired at their ships by a government that has decided that controlling who passes through the strait is worth the lives of however many of those mariners are killed in the enforcement. Nearly a dozen of them are dead, wounded, or missing this morning. Each of them had a life before they got on that ship. Each of them was doing the work that the global economy's logistics depend on functioning. The IRGC killed them to assert control over a waterway from which CENTCOM just eliminated its last cruise missile launch sites in 90 minutes. The three simultaneous pressure tracks, converging on July 15, 2026, have entered a phase whose compressive logic is now operating against the Iranian state at every level simultaneously. The military track has reached the point where the remaining IRGC cruise missile infrastructure at Greater Tunb Island, the sites that were still functional enough to hit 7 commercial ships, can be entirely eliminated in 90 minutes from a standing start. The same persistent ISR architecture that found the ballistic missile storage in the Desful hillside, the same targeting chain that hit 6 cities simultaneously in a 5-hour window, the same strike packages that have been operating every night for a week. They are now so effective at finding and destroying the remaining IRGC military infrastructure that the timeline from strike initiation to complete target elimination has compressed to 90 minutes for a mission of this scope. The infrastructure track is the new dimension being publicly activated through Trump's Fox News statement. Power plants, bridges, the compression campaign named aloud. This track does not target IRGC military capability. It targets the physical infrastructure of the Iranian state itself, the substrate that the IRGC needs to maintain any claim to governing the country, to providing the functions of government, to justifying its own existence as the authority structure of 89 million people. The human track is what the mariners represent. Each commercial ship struck, each mariner killed or wounded, is a data point in the accumulating record of what the IRGC's continued existence costs in human terms, a record that justifies every targeting decision in the compression campaign, in the most direct moral terms available. You do not need strategic doctrine to justify stopping the thing that is killing mariners on commercial ships. You need the operational capability to stop it. CENTCOM has demonstrated it has that capability in every mission it has executed. What changes with the compression campaign is not the justification for striking Iran. The justification has been self-evident since the first mariner was killed. What changes is the scope of what is being struck and the stated intention to continue until the striking stops. The structural risk that the compression campaign introduces, the risk that serious analysts are genuinely wrestling with, is the risk that targeting civilian infrastructure creates humanitarian consequences for the Iranian population that become the dominant political story of this conflict, overriding the narrative of IRGC aggression and commercial ship attacks that has sustained the coalition's political coherence to this point. Power plants going dark across Iran affect not just the IRGC's operations, but the hospitals, treating injured Iranians, the water treatment facilities processing drinking water, the dialysis machines keeping kidney patients alive, the incubators keeping premature infants alive, the cold chains keeping insulin viable for diabetics. The Iranian population that has been protesting in the streets and dying for it is not the IRGC. It is the population that the compression campaign will most directly harm in the immediate term, while its strategic logic plays out over the medium term. The compression campaign's architects have calculated that the medium-term strategic effects, the collapse of IRGC governing capacity, the acceleration of internal fracture, the creation of conditions for the Iranian people to finish what they started in the streets, justify the immediate-term civilian harm. That calculation may be correct. It is not comfortable. The honest strategic assessment of July 15, 2026, places the compression campaign's public announcement in the context of an operational arc that has been building toward exactly this moment since the first American strike on February 28th. The military targets, the ones that could be destroyed without making civilian power disappear, have been systematically eliminated across 6 nights of escalating operations. Greater Tunb Island's cruise missile sites took 90 minutes to complete this morning. The IRGC's remaining conventional military capacity in the Strait of Hormuz is a fraction of what it was when this conflict began. The naval blockade is in force. The UAE is flying strike missions. Saudi Arabia is crushing the Houthi proxy network. The Russian scientists have been evacuated from the nuclear facilities. The Ocean Trader is positioned off Oman with 160 operators whose mission has not been publicly announced. The compression campaign is what comes after the purely military phase has achieved everything the purely military phase can achieve without hitting the infrastructure that powers the state, that houses the institution, that the purely military phase cannot eliminate from the air alone. Power plants, bridges, named on Fox News at 6 a.m. on July 15, 2026. Greater Tunb Island's cruise missile sites were already gone by 7:30 a.m. 90 minutes, start to finish. The mariners on the 7 ships that the IRGC struck this week were trying to transit a waterway in international waters. Nearly a dozen of them are dead, wounded, or missing. Their ships were hit by weapons fired from a location that no longer exists as a functioning IRGC missile base. The IRGC's cruise missiles found the mariners. CENTCOM's precision munitions found the launch sites. And Trump named what comes next on national television at dawn for anyone paying attention. The compression campaign has a name now. It has public targets. It has operational momentum. And the Iranian state's power infrastructure is not underground, is not dispersed across a mountain range, and is not going anywhere. The doctrine of depth does not apply to power plants. They are exactly where they have always been. What the compression campaign's public announcement changes, beyond the immediate targeting calculus, is the entire diplomatic framework within which this conflict has been operating. Every previous diplomatic approach to this conflict has operated under the implicit assumption that there exists a set of terms under which the IRGC would accept a negotiated resolution that preserves some version of the Iranian state's governing capacity. That assumption has informed every ceasefire, every MOU negotiation, every Qatari and Pakistani mediation effort. It has been the foundational premise of every diplomatic initiative. There is a deal available if the pressure reaches the right level and the terms are right. Trump naming power plants and bridges on Fox News does something specific to that assumption. It communicates that the American position has moved from seeking a negotiated resolution at a pressure point the IRGC can survive to seeking a level of pressure that goes beyond what the IRGC can survive in its current form. A compression campaign targeting electrical infrastructure and bridge connectivity across the Iranian state is not a pressure campaign designed to bring an adversary to the negotiating table. It is a campaign designed to eliminate the adversary's capacity to function as the governing institution of a state. Those are different objectives with different implied endpoints, and Trump named the new objective publicly, which means the implied endpoint has been publicly accepted at the highest level of American decision-making. The Iranian population that has been protesting in the streets, that has been killed in numbers exceeding 50,000 by the IRGC's suppression apparatus, that has been watching the military campaign degrade the IRGC's physical infrastructure with something between hope and anguish, will process the compression campaign's public announcement in a specific way. Power going dark across Iran does not feel the same to the Iranian population as IRGC naval bases burning in Bandar Abbas. Naval bases going up in smoke is the IRGC losing. Power going out in Tehran is life becoming harder for everyone. The distinction matters politically, even if it does not matter militarily. The IRGC is counting on that distinction. Its communications apparatus, to the extent that it still functions under the degradation the conflict has imposed, will attempt to frame the compression campaign's civilian infrastructure targeting as American war crimes, as deliberate attacks on the Iranian people rather than on the IRGC that governs them against their will. That framing is not without some resonance in international public opinion. The distinction between a government and the people it governs is morally clear. The physical distinction between the infrastructure that sustains the government and the infrastructure that sustains the people governed is considerably less clear when the same power plant provides electricity to both. The compression campaign's architects know this. The decision to pursue it publicly, to name the targets on Fox News, suggests a calculation that the moral and legal case for targeting civilian infrastructure in this specific context as the mechanism for ending an institution that has killed 50,000 of its own citizens and is attacking commercial shipping while claiming to escort it, has been assessed as sustainable against the counter-narrative the IRGC will attempt to construct. That assessment may be correct. The counter-narrative requires the IRGC to simultaneously maintain that it is providing safe transit to commercial ships, while 7 commercial ships are being struck by IRGC cruise missiles. The credibility ceiling of that argument has been severely constrained by the operational evidence. The diplomatic communities that will most urgently need to respond to the compression campaign's announcement are not in Tehran. They are in Doha, in Islamabad, in Beijing, and in Moscow. Qatar and Pakistan have been the diplomatic lifelines through which every previous ceasefire in this conflict has been brokered. They have maintained those roles through the most sustained military exchange in the region's recent history because both governments calculated that their mediator status provided strategic value, exceeding the cost of maintaining relationships with a regime under military attack. The compression campaign targeting civilian infrastructure creates a different calculus for those governments. Mediating a ceasefire between an American military campaign targeting IRGC naval installations and an IRGC retaliating with ballistic missiles at Gulf state military bases is one thing. Mediating between an American campaign targeting Iranian civilian power infrastructure and an IRGC retaliating with cruise missiles at commercial ships carrying civilian mariners is something that carries greater domestic political cost for the mediating governments. The further the compression campaign advances into civilian infrastructure targeting, the more difficult the diplomatic position of the states that have been sustaining the mediation architecture becomes. China's position deserves specific attention because Beijing's relationship to the Iranian crisis has been the quiet variable that most consistently goes unaddressed in Western analytical coverage. China has been Iran's primary energy purchaser. the customer that has been absorbing Iranian crude through the back channels and workarounds that the sanctions regime has not fully closed. Chinese purchases of Iranian oil have provided the financial foundation that has allowed the Islamic Republic to sustain some level of economic function, despite the sanctions architecture designed to prevent exactly that. A compression campaign that targets Iranian oil production infrastructure and the power plants that sustain that infrastructure directly affects China's energy supply chain in ways that Beijing cannot ignore. China has been watching this conflict from a position of calculated ambiguity, neither condemning the IRGC's aggression against commercial shipping nor endorsing the American military response. That ambiguity has served Chinese interests by preserving relationships with both parties and maintaining the possibility of positioning Beijing as a diplomatic player in any eventual resolution. The compression campaign's public announcement creates pressure on that ambiguity. If Iranian power plants go dark, Iranian oil production capacity decreases, and China's energy import picture changes in ways that have real economic consequences for Chinese industrial operations. Beijing will be required to make decisions about how to respond, whether to absorb the economic impact, whether to pursue diplomatic intervention to prevent the compression campaign from advancing further, or whether to find alternative energy supplies that reduce Chinese exposure to the Iranian disruption. Russia's position has been partially revealed by the evacuation of Russian technical personnel from Iranian nuclear and military facilities through the Special Flight Squadron's continuous operations. The Russian decision to extract its most valuable human assets while continuing to supply weapons through the inbound flights is the behavioral signature of a government that has calculated this conflict will reach a conclusion that makes continued Russian presence in Iranian facilities untenable before the conflict ends. The compression campaign's public announcement, reaching civilian power infrastructure rather than exclusively military sites, confirms the directional forecast that informed the Russian evacuation calculation. Moscow is removing its people from the path of a campaign that is expanding rather than contracting. Now go back to what the 90-minute completion of the Greater Tunb Island operation tells you about the operational tempo that the compression campaign will inherit. 6 nights of escalating strikes reduced the target set on Greater Tunb Island from whatever it was at the beginning of this conflict to whatever it was at 6 a.m. on July 15th. A set of cruise missile storage and launch sites sufficient to strike 7 commercial ships, sized to require 90 minutes for complete elimination. That 90-minute completion timeline tells you that the current strike architecture, the persistent ISR that identifies and tracks targets, the F-35 stealth that leads the strike package into defended airspace, the growlers and harms that suppress and destroy the air defense systems protecting those spaces, the precision munitions delivered against confirmed targets, has reduced the military target set in the southern Iranian theater to a scale that the existing strike infrastructure can process and complete in operationally very short windows. The compression campaign's infrastructure targets, the power plants and bridges that Trump named on Fox News, will not require suppression of enemy air defenses to reach, because the enemy air defense network has been systematically eliminated across the 6 nights that preceded this morning. Power plants are not defended by air defense systems that require F-16 CJ Wild Weasels to suppress before strike aircraft can engage them. They are large, fixed, readily identifiable installations sitting exactly where satellite imagery has been watching them for the entire duration of this conflict. The targeting solutions for Iranian power infrastructure are not intelligence challenges. They are targeting queue management decisions about sequence and timing. The compression campaign can begin at any moment that the decision is made to begin it. The operational infrastructure is in place. The intelligence picture is complete. The targeting solutions exist. The strike aircraft are ready. The decision is the only remaining variable. Trump named the campaign on Fox News at 6 a.m. on July 15th, 2026. By 7:30 a.m., Greater Tunb Island's cruise missile sites had been eliminated. The compression campaign has been announced. The first operation of the day has been completed in 90 minutes, and power plants across Iran are still running, still providing electricity to the IRGC's command and control infrastructure, to the facilities where the remaining IRGC military capacity is being maintained, to the institutions through which the regime continues to claim governing authority over the country it has been destroying from within. How much longer they run is now a public question with a public answer already given by the president, who named what comes next. The mariners on the 7 ships are dead or wounded or missing. The cruise missiles that hit them were fired from a location that no longer exists. The IRGC that fired those missiles is an institution whose military infrastructure is being eliminated in 90-minute increments, whose internal command structure is fracturing on live television, whose clerics are calling its diplomatic efforts treason, and whose shadow generals continue to fire at commercial ships because stopping would mean being something other than what they have always been. Power plants, bridges, the compression campaign named aloud. The doctrine of depth cannot protect a power plant. The underground cities and hardened bunkers and hillside missile storage facilities were built to survive air power. Power plants were built to generate electricity. They were not built to survive 30-minute precision strikes from aircraft that have been flying over the country unopposed for a week. They are exactly where they have always been. The compression campaign has been announced. Greater Tunb Island sites are already gone. The power is still on in Iran. It is not guaranteed to be on tomorrow.